All right, so having sort of pressed upon you some of those principles, I want to jump into the text. I'm going to do it in this installment from the front, and then in a latter installment, really effectively from the back. And I want to consider, as we come in from the front, I want to consider John Ray Jr.'s foreword. And I ask you to think about what it might be contributing, and there are multiple answers to that question. But I'm going to highlight two. One is that one of the things Nabokov abhorred, and I think you get the flavor of this a little bit from the way that he both borrows from and seeks to distinguish himself from his predecessors. He abhors categorization, right? Abhors a black and white approach to the world, let's say. A world that produces, an approach that produces and relies upon data as a means of reaching the truth, for example, that wants to classify human beings, assign them as types, assign them types or roles as types. And what John Ray Jr. does, of course, is traffic in all of this stuff that Nabokov abhors. So, for instance, and just to pick a couple of key moments, he traffics in the cliches of public education, of the social worker, of certain kinds of politicians, of the clinician, cliches of certain kinds of public discourse. The most obvious and perhaps illuminating example is the very end, beginning on page 5 onto page 6. As a case history, Lolita will become, no doubt, a classic in psychiatric circles, which means immediately, right, that the novel that will follow, the text will follow, has an application into the realm of human sciences, right? It's not autotelic. It is not autonomous. It is not solely dedicated to providing aesthetic bliss, but now, right, John Ray Jr.'s argument is that it has applicable function, that it is in fact delivering wisdom, right, lesson. Anyway, I'll continue. Skipping down a couple of lines, beyond its literary worth is the ethical impact the book should have on the serious reader. For in this poignant personal study, there lurks a general lesson: the wayward child, the egotistical monster, the pantomaniac. These are not only vivid characters in a unique drama, they warn us of dangerous trends. They point out potent evils. Lolita should make all of us, parents, social workers, educators, apply ourselves with still greater vigilance and vision to the task of bringing up a better generation in a safer world. Right, so those platitudes and cliches. To home in on another version of this, on page 5 near the top, this paragraph that carries over, I'm looking about 5 lines down, 3 lines down, let's say. So the cynic may say that commercial pornography makes the same claim. The learned may counter by asserting that H.H.'s impassioned confession is a tempest in a test tube, that at least 12% of adult American males, a conservative estimate, according to Dr. Blanche Schwartzman, verbal communication, enjoy yearly in one way or another the special experience H.H. describes with such despair. So 2 things to note. One, of course, is that there's an effort to think of Humbert Humbert and the novel Lolita that follows as not unique, never mind autonomous, but as participating in 12% as classifiable, right, as a version of the experience that some percentage of adult males have yearly. And second, that the source of that information, Blanche Schwartzman, white black man, is herself a signifier of this whole approach to life, to live experience that seeks to draw data and classify it, right? A white-black perspective of the world, Blanche Schwartzman. So what this does in the first instance is set us up to approach the text as though, right, it were, an example of, right? As though it might, in fact, be, um, you know, participating in this view of the world, that it has a moral or a lesson to deliver. Um, but by setting us up, right, to enter the novel from that point of view, the very opening of the novel, of course, um, destroys that. So here we have on page 9 the opening of the novel proper. Lolita, light of my life, fire of my loins, my sin, my soul, Lolita, a tip of the tongue taking a trip of 3 steps down the palate to tap at 3 on the teeth, Lolita. She was low, playing low in the morning. You probably have, know this introduction, this opening from one way or another. What is it that strikes us about it? Well, for one thing, it's impassioned. For another, it's sensual, and in these ways is an assault on, is the opposite of, but also an assault on, I would say, John Ray Jr.'s language. Hey, approach this. Think about this scientifically. Think about its value. Psychiatric circles. Think about how you can apply the lessons learned here as an educator, a social worker, right, a politician. But of course, when we reach Humbert, what he's giving us is an entirely other view of the phenomenon at the heart of this novel. One that's sensual, one that's passionate, one that is, I would also playful, right? Playful with language in the immediate sense. Playfulness is a theme I'll come back to in the next installment. Also note the way, I love this, note the way that he puts, right at the very beginning of the novel, puts Lolita in our mouths, right? So we have a sensual experience of the name that helps to orient us in the way that Humbert is oriented toward Lolita and toward every aspect of her, but also the sort of space, if you will, that the name, right, and therefore the association with Lolita sort of takes up, right, which is very different than the way that John Ray Jr. approaches it. Calling attention to language in general, and this would be this will be a thread I want us to pick up together next week on Wednesday when we meet, is what is the what is the nature of this language? What are its preoccupations? How does it orient us to the phenomenon, to the events of the novel, to the characters of the novel? How does it produce for us an experience? Right. So, what is particular about this language? And I want to take a moment to sort of shift from that to think about Eliot and Joyce in this novel. So you have, as an attachment in an email, this poem by T.S. Eliot, Gerontian, which means old man. This was written as a kind of warm-up to The Wasteland. It is a novel, or is it a novel? It is a poem that speaks very directly and forcefully to the sense of crisis in Europe. And I'll read you a bit of it so that you get the flavor of it, and then we're going to look at what Nabokov does with it. So here I am. This is how Gerontian opens. Here I am, an old man in a dry month, being read to by a boy, waiting for rain. I was neither at the hot gates, nor fought in the warm rain, nor knee-deep in the salt marsh, heaving a cutlass, bitten by flies, fought. A little farther on, in the third stanza, in depraved May, dogwood and chestnut, flowering Judas, to be eaten, to be divided, to be drunk among whisperers. By Mr. Silvero with his caressing hands at Limoges, who walked all night in the next room. By Hakugawa bowing among the Titans. By Madame de Torquist in the dark room, shifting the candles. Fraulein von Kolp, who turned in the hall, one hand on the door, vacant shuttles, weave the wind, I have no ghosts, an old man in a drafty house. So that second stanza I read to you, the third stanza of the poem, these are the devourers of innocence, the devourers of rebirth. They are named, but they're not elaborated upon, and who they might refer to is an open question. But the job here is not to talk about Eliot, but rather to get us to look at page 16 of Lolita. Humbert is describing his youth, his Mankay, right? Mankay talent. He turned to literature, right, as a failed poet. But it suited him on the bottom of 15. I switched to English literature, where so many frustrated poets end as pipe-smoking teachers in tweeds. Paris suited me. And among the things he did there was publish tortuous, this is on 16, tortuous essays in obscure journals and composed pastiches. Fraulein von Kolp may turn her hand upon the door. I will not follow her, nor Fresca, nor that Gaul. So you can see how this is a direct reference to Eliot's poem. But what's he do with it? He's not honoring it or its sense of crisis or its accomplishment as a work of art, but he's burlesquing it. He's turning it into, a poem about nymphets, Fraulein, right, young woman von Kolp, Fresca, right. Anyway, so there's a sense of the relationship to predecessors, to especially, right, these high moderns. But I want to say something about the nature of parody here. One might, that kind of learned reader who will, Nabokov is as an engineer, as a technician, striving to produce the autonomous work of art, whose job is only to provide aesthetic bliss, is very likely to recognize Fraulein von Kolp and to bring the sense of Gramscian, if not the particulars of the poem, into the reading here. But what that reader would find, right, is a burlesque, right, a sharp turn on what's expected. And Nabokov, this is one of Nabokov's sort of favorite things to do. In fact, he names this move the Knight's Move. Nabokov, as you may know, obsessed with chess. Illusion Defense, one of my favorite of his novels, written about a chess master. But what he so this idea of the Knight's Move, which is a way of thinking about a certain element of his aesthetic, certainly the way he thinks about parody, the way he thinks about his relationship to his predecessors, among other things, as a sort of narrower technique we'll look at in a moment. The Knight's Move, what the knight, of course, on the chessboard does that's different from any other character is it doesn't move only in a straight line, but hops, right? Either two steps in one direction and a third in another direction, or vice versa, one and then two. It's the only piece on the board that moves in that way, and it can hop over other characters. So this notion of a sudden shift, sort of set up to go in one direction, only to end up going in another direction, is very central to Nabokov's thinking about what's available to him as an artist. And as I mentioned, right, he names the move, his own move, after calls it the Knight's Move. This is one sort of example of it, right? I'm evoking the seriousness of high modern art, of high modern literature, but I'm taking it in another direction, right? Two steps in one direction, and then, right, the surprise move at the end. I'll be back in a moment.